This is the story of Walter Remers. He's my great-grandfather. He's my mother's father's father. I can only remember him being mentioned twice during my childhood. One was in the mid-70s, and I just remember there was a conversation going on, and I was quite young, and people were talking about war. And I remember asking my great-grandpa Art if he had ever been in a war. And I don't remember even if he answered me, but I do remember hearing my great-grandma from the dining rooms where she was setting the dishes saying, "Your real grandfather, he died in World War I." And that's it. That's all I remember. I don't remember if we had any discussions about it, anything. Years later, I remember being with my great aunt Barbara, who would be Bommy's daughter, and seeing a picture on her dresser. And I had no idea who this person was. I knew it was an old photograph, so I just asked her, "Who's in this picture?" And she goes, "That's me and my daddy." And I don't remember what the picture looks like. I don't remember if we talked about him more or anything. And I actually didn't recall this memory for many years later. When I was a young child, I only knew 7 people I was biologically related to. There was my mom and my mom's sister, my Nana, who was my grandma, my mom's mom, and Nana's mother, Bommy Lily, and my Nana's mother-in-law, Bommy Alma, and her daughter, Great Aunt Barbara, and then Bommy Alma's brother, Great-Great-Uncle Ed. Now, we fast forward about 30 years later, and in 2010, I decided to begin my journey in researching my family history. I was armed with very little, as I knew nearly nothing about my father's side and barely more about my mother's. I started with who I knew, the names of my parents, the name of my Nana, my maternal grandmother, and her mother, Bommy Lily. I knew the name of my great-grandma Alma, Bommy Alma, and I knew that she had 2 children, Jack and Barbara, Jack my grandfather and Aunt Barbara. So why did I start with Bommy Alma? One, she was the highest one in my tree, so I thought, she's the oldest, I'll start with her and see what I can find out. But also, she helped raise me. I had a very special bond with my Bommy Alma, and we were very close when I was a child, and I really, really had missed her. I hadn't seen her since I was about 7 years old, and I missed her terribly. So I knew she was born in the late 1800s, as I can remember that my great aunt Barbara had a decorative calendar on her wall, and it was one of those long embroidered calendars, and I remember it being 1890 something, and I asked her what it was, and she said it was the year her mom was born. I do know she was Swedish, and so I wasn't sure if she was from Sweden or anything, and I didn't even know her maiden name. I knew the names that she had used, Remers and Wilcox, Grandpa Art, and then my elusive great-grandfather that I knew nothing about. So I plugged what I knew into Anne's history and quickly found a death record for her in July 1978. And on it, it gave me the middle name of Amelia. Armed with the full name, Alma Amelia Nelson Remers, I tried to find our newspapers because I remembered that my grandfather, Jack, was in World War II and he was captured as a POW. And there was lots of articles in the Oakland Tribune and the San Francisco Chronicle around that time about the POWs. And she kept all those in a special book that she made about her son. So I tried doing a search for that, and I actually came up with nothing on Jack. So I pulled out the name Jack just in case they put him in as John or just Jay. So I put Alma, I put Remers, and I was looking in the Bay Area of California. What I found was something I was not expecting to find. In the March 30th, 1913 Oakland Tribune article, a wedding announcement of Amelia Alma Nelson to a Walter Remers. They were married in a quiet ceremony with no attendance. The pastor, N.A. Baker, a close friend of the groom, and they were to honeymoon in Oregon. I don't think I ever heard his name before, so I wasn't absolutely 100% positive that this was my great-grandpa and my great-grandma. And so I decided to do some more searching, and I ordered a marriage certificate from California and crossed my fingers that there was one. And there was. When I got it in the mail, I was so excited. It's actually 2 pages, and on the second page it lists Amelia's parents as Peter Nelson and Margaret Holt. It lists his parents as Edward Remers and Helen Steinlet. So I wanted to know so much more about him. I had this bug for him, and I wanted to know everything I could find on him. So in the marriage certificate, it states he's 26 years old. He was born in California. He works as a journeyman telephone technician. It lists Bommy's age as 22 and that she was born in Kansas. I thought she might have been born in Sweden. Turns out Kansas. So that gave me more to look for her as well. So armed with a name and approximate birth year, I went on the hunt for Walter. I started with the World War I draft, as he was the right age to be in the World War I, and Mommy had mentioned that he had died in World War I. There were a few Walter Remer and only a couple of Walter Remers in the World War I draft. One of them was born in the proper year to be 26 in March of 1913. The only other man was 19 at the time. It seems unlikely you would confuse a 19-year-old with a 26-year-old when you get married, so I'm fairly certain I was on the right path. So the World War I draft card was signed on the 5th of June, 1917, and he was listed as living in Milwaukee, Oregon, with a wife and 2 children. All my family were Californians. I never heard of anyone in my family living in Oregon, so I backtracked and started researching Aunt Barbara and Grandpa Jack. Turns out they were both born near Portland, Oregon. And I had no idea. And I found that really ironic since I had moved to Oregon in my adulthood, and I just had no idea I had ties to Oregon when I moved here. So I remembered they honeymooned in Oregon, and I went back to his daughter's information, and on her death record it states she was born in Oregon in 1914. So now I looked for Grandpa Jack's death record and found he too was born in Oregon in 1916. Walter is now listed as a merchant marine for occupation and born in San Francisco, California, which is what his marriage certificate stated as well. But now I also had a date of birth, 28th November, 1886. Here's where things started getting complicated. It was a close hit came up on Walter, and I don't know if you know what a close hit is, but when you're looking, you get little hints, leaves, or you get other documents brought up when you're looking at a certain document. This might be the same person you're already looking at. So I clicked on it, though I was a little confused and almost didn't, because it was U.S. naturalization paperwork. Nobody born in California would be required to become a naturalized citizen, as that's what they are. So I found a declaration of intent. For those who don't know what a declaration of intent, it's the first papers you submit when applying for citizenship in the United States. Now, if he were born in San Francisco, California, he would be considered a natural-born citizen. However, on the 6th of August, 1914, just a few months after his daughter had been born, Walter Remers applied to become a U.S. citizen. He declared he was born in Hanover, Germany on the 28th of November, 1886. That he lived in Hamburg prior to boarding the Milverton and arriving in San Diego, California on the 17th of May, 1903. So now I have all kinds of questions. If Walter was not born in California and truly was born in Germany, why would he be lying? So I even looked for the 1910 U.S. Census, being that the 1900 census wouldn't be valid for him if he didn't get here till 1903. And the 1890 census doesn't exist, and that would be the only 3 censuses that would have been around in the U.S. during his lifetime. In the 1910 census, I did find him. He was working on a steamship called the Coaster, and they listed him as Walter Remers. He was a waiter, and he was born in California. So then I started thinking about the unpopularity of Germans in 1914. But it would have still have been a problem back in 1903. So I did some research. In 1871, the German unification propelled Germany onto the world stage now as a global power. They began an imperialistic expansion into other areas of the world, sometimes coming up against the United States. And by the early 20th century, attitudes started shifting regarding German Americans. So if I look at the Declaration of Intent, I see Walter arrived in the port of San Diego in 1903 at 16 years old on the Milverton. So what do I do next? I went and found the Milverton. She wasn't a passenger ship, she was a steamship, and she was delivering coal. Walter's journey started in Hamburg, Germany, to London, down around Africa, to Australia, to San Diego. Now, how can I possibly know all this? Well, the Milverton did not arrive in Australia on time. In fact, she was so late that there were articles being written in the papers. What has happened to the Milverton? Finally, after 105 days at sea, the Milverton docked in Sydney on the 3rd of January, 1903. They reported that they had been docked there earlier that day before Captain Sinclair said they encountered contrary winds across the Indian Ocean, past Tasmania 8 days prior. However, experienced something the captain hadn't quite experienced before, currents coming from the land out to the sea. When they were finally off Jervis Bay, they were still 90 miles off land to the west of Australia. Really? So I got into the story of his trek to America, but in the end, where was Walter? Well, I finally found a manifest in New Zealand, and that manifest says there's no Walter Remers on the Milverton. So I had studied all these newspaper articles, copied them, cut them, pasted them into a little PDF document, attached them to Walter, and Walter wasn't on the ship. I was so mad. But then I kept reading everybody. There wasn't a Remers, but there was a Steinland. And then my memory popped back over to that marriage certificate, Helen Steinland, mother of Walter Remers. This Steinland's name was Waldemar, so I double-checked, and Waldemar and Walter are basically the same name. Now, on the Milverton, he was listed with 3 other young men from Germany as an OS, ordinary seaman. Walter was only in America for one census, like I said, the 1910. So I don't have any other documentation to back up the fact that he was from Germany other than his declaration of intent. Since the one census is California, his marriage certificate says California, his World War I draft registration says California. So I looked at the signatures on the World War I draft registration and compared it to the signature on the U.S. Declaration of Intent. The signatures are pretty clearly a match. So after that, you've got about 6 to 7 weeks after his daughter Barbara Helen was born, he decided to become a citizen. Why now? He's been in America for 11 years. There's a couple of good answers out there, one being that he just wanted to be a U.S. citizen for real and not have to worry about it anymore. Being a German in America in 1914 couldn't have been easy. German sentiments were dropping daily. Another thing could have to do with the fate of his wife and his daughter. For this, we need to go back to the 2nd of March, 1907, and the passage of the Expatriate Act. Now, this is a little-known law delivered one hell of a punch to women. Balmy Alma was born in Kansas, and as a result was a naturally born U.S. citizen. Because of this law passed in 1907, when she married Walter, a German citizen, Balmy Alma now lost her U.S. citizenship and became a German citizen. Wives would become a citizen of the country of their husband and was a citizen upon the I do's. Now, as far as Aunt Barbara was concerned, I think she'd fall back into the U.S. citizenship, being born in Oregon. However, being the child of 2 German citizen parents would be bad for her, given the current climate. So it wasn't until 1922 and the passing of something called the Cable Act, right after women's suffrage and women had the right to vote, many politicians were trying to get on the women's good side. So they decided to repeal the idea that just because you married a man, foreign born, that you would actually lose your own citizenship. However, there was a lot of fine print in these laws, and women who had married men of Asian descent were not granted that privilege till years later. And it wouldn't be until 1936 that new amendments to this Congress would allow the repatriation of native-born women who have heretofore lost their citizenship by marriage to an alien. So it wasn't until 1936 that Balmy Alma was again a U.S. citizen. So these might be some of the reasons why Walter was thinking maybe he needed to become a U.S. citizen. It may have been he was trying to hide, being a German, as it does seem he was trying to do over and over again by pretending he was born elsewhere. He had requested his naturalization paperwork from the federal government, but they were unable to find anything. other than the declaration of intent I had already found. So it doesn't seem he completed his process before he died 4 years later. 14 months after his son Jack was born, Walter joined a brand new nautical school in Portland, Oregon in July 1917. In the paper it says, all along the waterfront, Walter Remers of Milwaukee, who was the first to file his application for entrance into Portland's free government nautical school, today is completing his examinations before the local steam vessels inspectors, being the third Portland student to finish. Remers had 4 years and 2 months experience prior to 1907 on sailing vessels and steamers. As fate would have it, Walter's number came up on the draft. The young father of two and husband joined the U.S. Navy on October 25, 1918. He entered basic training in Bremerton, Washington, joining a war against his homeland where his family still lived. I can't begin to understand how conflicting that would have had to been for him. However, Walter never made it to Germany. In fact, he never actually made it to the war. A scant 17 days later, World War I ended. I can only imagine the relief that must have washed over bombing Alma with her 4-year-old and 19-month-old children. However, her relief would be short-lived. 13 days later, Walter came down with the flu. And it wasn't any old flu. It was the 1918 pandemic flu that killed over 50 million people. In World War I, 53,402 American soldiers died in battle. 45,000 more just to the flu. 2 days after being taken ill, Walter succumbed and died 2 days before his 32nd birthday. I spent the next several years looking into no avail for Walter's final resting place. I called every cemetery in Bremerton and Portland, and I was unable to find him. Years later, I was looking for my grandfather's interment, Jack, his son, and called a cemetery in Oakland where my mom said he should be. I asked if he was there, and they said he was. I asked if Aunt Barbara was there, too. They looked it up and found her as well. I figured if both Bommy's children were there, she might be there also. So I asked, and they found her, too. So then on a slim chance, I asked if there was a Walter Remers. They confirmed he was interred with Alma and Jack. I remember I started crying. I remember the person on the phone was a little stunned. I explained I had been looking for him for so many years and called every cemetery in the area of his death and his home. Apparently, Alma brought him home with her, where she returned to raise their children. Years later, in World War II, his son Jack Edwards Remers was a bombardier over Europe. He would be shot down near Munster, Germany, and captured as a POW. Unlike Walter, Jack would eventually return home back to his mother, but not after a long torment of wondering if she would lose him too. And until yesterday, this is where my story with Walter ended. But then, yesterday, I found things I have been looking for the last 9 years. On a whim, I went to a Facebook group called German Genealogy, and I asked, why would a boy in 1903 pretend he wasn't born in Germany when he came to America? And I explained what I knew about him, and they said, one person mentioned, it's very possible he's illegitimate, and he's using his mother's name, because he used his mother's name to come over on the ship, and then chose to use his birth father's name when he got to America, because in Germany, he was required to use his mother's name. So I did a look. I did a look for a Walter Steinland and Waldemar Steinland and found nothing. So I looked for a Helen Steinland. And that's when things got interesting again. So I found a death record for a Helen Steinland. And she died on the 11th of May, 1942 in Hamburg, Germany. And according to Walter's declaration of intent, the last place he lived in Germany was, in fact, Hamburg. So I got a copy of her death record offline, and I think it's just one that was typed up later. I don't think it's the original death record. But it lists her name as not Helen Steinland. That turns out is a married name. Her birth name was Helen with an E at the end, Caroline with a K, Frederica, Steinland, maiden name Sputus. Sputis. Sputus. I was like, who the heck? Is this my person? Is it not? I don't know. So it gives me the name of her father, August Henrik Ludwig Sputus, and his mother, Hanna Carolina Christina Stappel. So I'm like, okay, let's see. She's the right age. She was, at least 20 years old when Walter was born. Let's see what I can find out. So then I put in her maiden name and do a search. And I come up with a baptism record for a son born the 28th of November, 1886. Now that's Walter's date of birth. And the chances that I find a Helen Steinland, who later becomes a Steinland, having a son named Walter, having a son born November 28th, 1886, was a little remarkable, and I'm pretty certain I'm on the right path with this one. But the son's name wasn't just Waldemar Steinland. So his actual name is Karl Waldemar Joseph George Sputus, born in Hanover, November 28th, 1886. And the records actually show for Helen Sputus that she had another son exactly 4 years after she had Walter. This son's name is Egan Paul, born the 28th of November again, but this time in 1990, which I find a little weird. But to be honest, my sister and we were born a day apart, 10 years later, so maybe it's a family thing, I'm not sure, but I think it brings another flavor to the story, and I'm hoping someday I can find more about Egan as well. I had somebody translate the records for me online. He graciously did it without me even asking, actually. I was going to have to try to find someone else to do it. And in those translated records, it turns out that in 1897, he was adopted by a Henrik Karl Edward Steinland, the same man who married Helen Caroline Frederick Sputus around that same time. And they all moved to Hamburg. So I think I may finally know Walter's real name. I still don't know much about his father. I am planning on getting copies of his adoption records, if they exist, and his birth certificate. I'm having a little hard time finding out how to get a birth certificate from Hanover, Germany, but I will figure this out. So it was an amazing journey to find out so much about Walter. And without him coming over and braving a ship trip when he's, across on a steamer when he was 15 years old, all the way here to America, and he traveled until he was 16. And then meeting my great-grandmother, none of us in our generation would be here. My mom's parent, my grandfather wouldn't be here, my mother, all of us. And I feel like our family story is a little more complete having found Walter and showing that his life mattered, no matter how short it was. And despite wars and prejudices and fears, that in the end, his life was about love. He loved his family, and he loved the sea, and he loved the life he built here in America, and was willing to fight to protect it, this life that he loved. Had there never been a pandemic that killed 50 million people, 50 million families, with hundreds of millions of stories left untold, it leaves me sad and grateful that I'm here around to live my story. And now I have an urgent need to tell the stories of those who came before me. I hope you enjoyed learning about Walter as much as I did, though your journey was much shorter than the 9 years I've been on this journey. Thanks. God bless.